A single line on a map could bankrupt an empire. This is the hidden power of cartographic deception. We are exploring the maps that lied and changed everything. You will discover how simple mistakes and deliberate falsehoods on ancient charts redirected the course of global commerce for centuries. What phantom island lured countless ships to their doom? And how did a misplaced coastline spark a financial crisis that toppled kings? By the end, you will see the familiar world map in a completely new light, understanding how fiction shaped our reality. What is the most convincing lie you have ever been told? His charts promised a safe harbor, but the sea offered only open water and jagged rocks. This was the terrifying reality for a 15th century navigator relying on a Portolan chart, a beautifully illustrated map believed to be the pinnacle of accuracy. His prized possession, drawn on stretched sheepskin and crisscrossed with room lines for plotting courses, had become a trap. The coastline it depicted so confidently simply did not exist. This was not sabotage, but something far more common in the age of exploration, a perfect cartographic storm of limited technology and human hope. Mapmakers of that era worked with a patchwork of information, stitching together vague accounts from merchants, tales from sailors who may have exaggerated their discoveries, and mathematical calculations that were often little more than educated guesses. They were trying to assemble a global jigsaw puzzle with 90% of the pieces missing. As the historian John Noble Wilford once observed, maps are a language of power, and like any language, they can be used to tell lies. But not all falsehoods are intentional. We can break these cartographic errors down into a few key categories. First were the innocent miscalculations. A ship's captain might misjudge a distance sailed or the angle of a coastline, and that single error would be copied and magnified across every subsequent map for generations. Then there were the phantom lands, islands, and mountains that appeared on maps for centuries, born from optical illusions like distant cloud banks mistaken for solid ground, or from the misinterpreted stories of foreign lands. Finally, we have the deliberate deceptions, the calculated insertions of non-existent territories to claim sovereignty, confuse rival nations, or protect lucrative trade routes. The line between an honest mistake and a strategic lie is often blurry, defined by the immense pressure and limited tools available to the mapmaker. Understanding this fragile foundation of early cartography is crucial because it sets the stage for the first, and perhaps most costly, category of all, the maps that bankrupted empires. A merchant captain, his hold packed with valuable spices, would deliberately steer his vessel away from a known shipping lane. His chart, drawn by a trusted cartographer, clearly showed a jagged coastline labeled the Isle of Demons. He was avoiding a hazard that was pure fiction, a phantom island born from fear and fog. These spectral lands are among history's most stubborn cartographic lies. They often began with a simple mistake. A distant bank of clouds on the horizon could solidify in a sailor's report into a mountainous shore. A massive, slow-moving iceberg, worn into strange shapes, might be logged as a new landmass. Or perhaps a storyteller, seeking fame or a better price for his tale, would embellish a sighting into a full-blown discovery. Once a respected mapmaker like Gerardus Mercator included such a place on his work, its existence became almost unshakable. Take the island of Friesland, which appeared southeast of Greenland on maps for over a century. It was likely a misreading of the coast of Iceland, yet it was so widely accepted that explorers sailed directly to its charted coordinates, finding only empty ocean. The consequences were measured in gold and time. A ship diverting its course to skirt a non-existent island added days or weeks to its journey, consuming more supplies and risking storms. The entire economy of a trade route could be subtly warped by the collective decision to avoid a cartographic ghost. Even in the modern era, this legacy persisted. An island called Sandy Island was clearly marked on maps off the coast of Australia, a solid black shape. Yet when a research vessel sailed to its location in 2012, their depth sensors showed only open ocean thousands of feet deep. The island had been a mirage on paper for over a century, a testament to the enduring power of a simple mark. These phantoms show us that a lie, once given the authority of ink and parchment, can redirect the flow of commerce and discovery for generations. But not every error on the map was born from seeing things that were not there. Some of the most costly mistakes came from a fundamental misreading of the world that was right in front of them. A coastline could be hundreds of miles from where your map promised it would be. This was the terrifying reality for a ship's captain in the age of sail, a direct result of the second great cartographic lie, the misplaced continent. Picture European explorers finally reaching the shores of South America, convinced they had found the northern tip of a mythical southern land, Terra Australis Incognita. For centuries, this enormous continent was considered a geographical certainty. The logic seemed sound to ancient scholars who believed the landmasses of the north must be balanced by an equal weight in the south to prevent the world from tipping over. This elegant theory, born in the minds of philosophers who had never sailed beyond the Mediterranean, was given the authority of ink and parchment by master mapmakers. Abraham Ortelius, in his famous World Atlas, depicted this southern landmass as a vast, shadowy shape encircling the bottom of the globe. His maps were not just drawings, they were invitations for kings and merchants to invest fortunes. Expeditions were launched with the sole purpose of finding and claiming this rich new world, a place they imagined was filled with gold and strange creatures. These voyages were not just journeys of discovery, they were high-stakes financial gambles based on a cartographic fantasy. The core of the problem was a simple, yet devastatingly difficult measurement to make: longitude. Determining how far east or west you had traveled was the greatest scientific challenge of the era. Without accurate timekeeping, a ship's navigator could only estimate their longitudinal position, and those estimates were often wrong by staggering margins. This is why the west coast of Africa on early Ptolemaic world maps appears so strangely squashed and distorted, and why the entire New World was often shown radically out of place. A merchant vessel sailing for what it believed was a nearby port might find itself still weeks away from land, its fresh water and food supplies dwindling to nothing. The human and economic cost was immense. A single miscalculation on a map could doom an entire fleet, wiping out a merchant's fortune and destabilizing a kingdom's economy. These misplaced continents show us that even the most logical assumptions, when drawn onto a map, could lead the world astray for centuries. But what happens when the deception is not a mistake of measurement, but a deliberate act of sabotage? A trader could have built his entire fortune on a single line drawn on a map, a line representing a river that flowed directly from the heart of Africa into the legendary Nile. This connection, if real, would have opened a trade route of unimaginable wealth, a direct waterway to the riches of the interior. But the river, like so many other features on the maps of the era, was a complete fiction. This leads us to the third great cartographic deception, the exaggerated landmark. When mapmakers faced vast, unknown territories, they were often pressured to fill the empty spaces. A blank area on a chart was a sign of ignorance, so they populated these voids with their best guesses, which often hardened into accepted fact. One of the most persistent of these inventions was the mountains of Kong. For nearly a century, this formidable, snow-capped range was drawn stretching across the entire width of West Africa. It was presented as an impassable barrier, a wall of stone that blocked easy access to the continent's interior. The message to European merchants and explorers was clear: do not attempt a land route here, the way is blocked. This single, non-existent mountain range actively discouraged overland trade and exploration in the region for generations, directing commercial and colonial efforts elsewhere based on a cartographic myth. The same pen that could create a mountain could also reroute a river or place a city 100 miles from its true location, all in service of a political or economic agenda. A king might commission a map that exaggerated the size of his own territory while shrinking a rival's lands. A trading company could produce charts that showed a treacherous, rocky coastline near a competitor's port, while depicting their own favored harbors as safe and easily accessible. These were not innocent mistakes, they were tools of economic warfare drawn on parchment. The authority of the map was so powerful that merchants would plan their cargoes and their voyages around these illusions, their real-world decisions dictated by lines and labels that bore no relation to the actual Earth. This demonstrates the ultimate power of the cartographer, the power not just to record the world but to invent it, and that power reaches its peak in the final, most audacious category of all: the maps that were designed from the very start to deceive. A secret master map locked away in a Lisbon fortress held the true shape of the world, but the copies sold to rivals were cleverly poisoned. This was the Padrão Real, Portugal's greatest state secret and its most powerful economic weapon. During the height of the Age of Discovery, controlling the sea lanes was synonymous with controlling wealth. Nations like Portugal and Spain did not just explore the world, they weaponized its geography. Their cartographers were not merely artists, they were agents of economic warfare, and their most effective tactic was the deliberate lie. Imagine you are a Dutch merchant. You pay a fortune for a Portuguese sea chart, believing it shows the true route to the spice-rich East Indies. You set sail with confidence, only to find yourself becalmed in a windless sea or driven onto a reef that was conveniently omitted from your map. Your voyage is a financial catastrophe while the Portuguese fleet, using the accurate master chart, sails on to secure its monopoly. This was not piracy with swords, but piracy with a pen. The stakes were astronomically high. A single doctored map could lure a competitor's entire fleet into a navigational trap, redirecting global trade for a season. Espionage networks were dedicated entirely to map theft. Rivals would pay spies exorbitant sums to sneak a peek at the Padrão Real, while Portuguese agents worked to plant believable forgeries in foreign courts. The goal was always the same: to protect the lucrative routes to the sources of pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. This was a shadow war fought in ink and parchment, where a coastline shifted a few degrees could mean the difference between a kingdom's prosperity and its ruin. The practice reveals a profound truth: in the right hands, a map was not a tool for finding your way, but for ensuring others lost theirs. This precision in deception required a sophisticated understanding of the very science that was meant to create accuracy, a paradox that brings us to the ingenious tools that made these grand deceptions possible. The very paper a map was printed on held a lie in its fundamental geometry. To translate our spherical world onto a flat surface required a mathematical trick, a projection, and each one came with its own unique form of distortion. Think of trying to flatten the peel of an orange. The skin must tear, stretch, or compress somewhere. Maps face the same impossible choice. The most famous of these, the Mercator projection, was a masterpiece of navigational aid that doubled as a powerful tool of misrepresentation. Created in the 16th century, its primary goal was to keep sailors on a straight line, a room line, making it invaluable for plotting ocean courses. But this convenience came at a steep price. To maintain those straight lines, the projection drastically exaggerated the size of everything near the poles. On a standard Mercator map, Greenland appears larger than the entire continent of Africa, when in reality Africa is 14 times larger. This was not a deliberate falsehood in its creation, but its widespread adoption had profound consequences. For a merchant in London or Amsterdam studying such a map, the lands of the global north, the domains of European empires, looked vast and dominant. The tropical regions and global south, crucial sources of spices, silk, and other goods, were shrunk in apparent importance. This visual bias subtly shaped geopolitical thinking for centuries, making colonial possessions seem more significant and downplaying the true scale of foreign continents. It was a lie of perspective baked into the mathematics. In response, other projections like the Peters projection emerged to correct this, prioritizing accurate land area over navigational straight lines. On a Peters map, the world looks unfamiliar, with Africa and South America stretched horizontally, reclaiming their true proportions. The choice between these projections was never neutral. A kingdom wanting to emphasize its imperial reach would favor Mercator. A rival seeking to highlight the navigational challenges of a competitor's claimed waters might commission a map using a different projection that made those sea routes appear even longer and more treacherous. Every map is a compromise, a selective telling of the truth. The cartographer chooses what to sacrifice: shape, distance, or direction, and that technical choice rippled out into the real world, guiding a merchant's investment, an explorer's ambition, and an empire's sense of its own place on the globe. This understanding of the map as a manipulated image forces a deeper question. If the very framework is subjective, how can we trust any single depiction of our world? The chilling sound of that ship's bell marks a grave that should never have existed. A single miscalculation of longitude on a captain's chart could transform a safe passage into a death sentence. The human cost of these cartographic lies was paid in shattered timber and lost lives. Take the tragic story of the HMS Wager, part of a British squadron sent on a mission of immense importance. Their charts, the best available at the time, depicted the western coast of South America with dangerous inaccuracy. In the brutal fog and rain of a Patagonian storm, the Wager, relying on those flawed maps, was driven onto rocks its crew believed were miles away. The ship was destroyed. The survivors faced a harrowing ordeal of starvation, mutiny, and desperate attempts to find civilization, all because the line representing the shore on their map was a lie. The Wager's fate was not unique. For every phantom island that caused a mere detour, there was a real reef or a misplaced cape that claimed an entire vessel. The ocean floors became a museum of these errors, littered with the wreckage of galleons whose holds were filled with incalculable wealth. Tons of Spanish silver from the New World, chests of Portuguese gold, precious Chinese silk, and entire harvests of Indonesian spices now rest in the deep, their value erased from the ledgers of commerce. The loss of a single such ship was a catastrophic financial event. It could ruin the wealthy investors who had backed the voyage and overwhelm the fledgling insurance syndicates in London or Amsterdam, causing premiums to skyrocket for every merchant. These individual disasters created ripples that could destabilize a nation's entire economy, as the flow of capital and goods was suddenly, violently interrupted. Behind every confidently drawn coastline on those old maps was not just ink, but the lives of sailors, the fortunes of merchants, and the stability of empires. This relentless toll of tragedy created an undeniable and urgent demand, a desperate cry for a solution that could finally anchor the map to the real world. A ship's captain in the 1700s could point to his exact position north or south with confidence, yet he was utterly blind to his location, east or west. This was the maddening reality of the longitude problem. Determining latitude was straightforward, a matter of measuring the sun's angle at noon or the height of the North Star. But longitude required knowing the precise time at a fixed starting point, like Greenwich, England, and comparing it to the local time on the ship. A pocket watch was useless on a rolling, salt-damp vessel, its mechanism thrown off by temperature changes and the constant motion of the sea. A timekeeping error of just a few minutes could translate to a navigational error of dozens of miles, so captains would essentially sail north or south to their correct latitude and then turn east or west, hoping for the best. They were sailing blind along a horizontal line, a practice known as running the parallel. This is why you see entire coastlines on old maps shifted sideways, as if the cartographer had pushed on the edge of the parchment. The most famous example is California, depicted on maps for over 200 years as a massive island separated from the mainland by a narrow strait. This was not a wild fantasy, it was a direct result of longitudinal miscalculation. An explorer would land, take a flawed longitudinal reading, and mapmakers would connect the dots, creating a coastline that was sometimes hundreds of miles out of position. The human and economic cost was staggering. Ships missed their landfalls, running out of food and fresh water. They struck unseen reefs or wasted weeks searching for ports that were not where the charts promised. The problem became so dire that in 1714, the British government offered a massive prize, £20,000, a fortune, for anyone who could solve it. The answer did not come from the great astronomers of the age, but from a humble, obsessive carpenter and self-taught clockmaker named John Harrison. He dedicated his life to building a clock that could keep perfect time at sea, a machine immune to the ocean's chaos. His final creation, the H4 chronometer, was a masterpiece of engineering no larger than a pocket watch. It was tested on a voyage to Jamaica and proved astonishingly accurate, losing only 5 seconds over the entire journey. The longitude problem was finally solved. Yet the old, error-riddled maps did not simply vanish. They continued to be used for decades, their persistent lies continuing to lure ships toward disaster long after the technology to correct them existed. For 200 years, the most powerful kingdoms in Europe believed California was an island. It was not a small error, but a colossal fiction, a separate landmass adrift in the Pacific. This was not the work of a single misguided cartographer, but a myth that grew from a seed of confusion. Early Spanish explorers sailing up the Gulf of California saw water to the east and west. They assumed this body of water, which we now call the Sea of Cortez, was a strait that cut all the way through to the open ocean, completely severing the land. A friar's written account of this apparent discovery was misinterpreted and then seized upon by the English mapmaker Henry Briggs. In 1625, he published a map that clearly showed the island of California, and the idea instantly captured the European imagination. It was a beautiful, elegant error, and it refused to die, even when Spanish missionaries and soldiers traveled overland, proving conclusively that California was firmly attached to the mainland. The reports were ignored or dismissed. The lie was simply more attractive than the truth. For a merchant in Madrid or a naval planner in London, the insular California was a tantalizing prospect. It suggested a direct sea route, the fabled Strait of Anian, a northern shortcut to the riches of the Orient that would bypass the long and dangerous trip around South America. This geographical phantom redirected the entire strategy of exploration. Expeditions were funded not to settle a peninsula, but to circumnavigate an island. Spanish colonial efforts were shaped by this illusion. focusing on maritime supply for an isolated territory that did not exist. The economic impact was profound, diverting vast sums of money and years of human effort into the pursuit of a strait that was nothing more than a line on a map. The island of California demonstrates a powerful principle. A good story, once it is printed and distributed, can be far more resilient than a boring fact. It takes more than evidence to kill a cartographic lie. It takes a complete shift in perspective. Deep in the heart of the African continent, a mountain range that never existed dictated the flow of commerce for 1,500 years. Mapmakers, from the great Ptolemy in the 2nd century to the most respected European cartographers of the 18th, all drew the same spectacular feature, the Montes Luni, or Mountains of the Moon. Ptolemy never traveled to Central Africa. He compiled his geography from the accounts of merchants and travelers, stitching together rumors of a great inland sea and a massive range of snow-capped peaks that were the reported source of the mighty Nile River. It was a logical, elegant theory. A river that vast must have an equally grand origin, so he placed these mountains on his world map, and his authority was so immense that his speculation became unassailable fact. For generation after generation, cartographers copied the Mountains of Moon directly onto their own charts, each one reinforcing the lie. The maps created a self-fulfilling prophecy. European merchants gazing at these charts saw a clear narrative. The riches of Africa's interior, its gold, ivory, and potential trade routes, were guarded by this formidable mythical wall. The quest to find the source of the Nile became synonymous with finding the Mountains of the Moon, a goal that obsessed explorers for centuries. Expeditions were planned and funded based on this cartographic ghost. Adventurers plunged into the jungle expecting to find a massive alpine range, only to be met with endless rainforest, swamps, and a confusing network of Great Lakes. They were searching for a landmark that was pure fiction, and their failure to find it only added to the mystery, making the interior seem even more impenetrable and mysterious. This single geographical myth actively warped the economic and exploratory efforts directed at an entire continent. The truth only began to emerge in the 19th century with explorers like John Hanning Speke. After a grueling journey, Speke stood on the shores of a vast body of water, which he named Lake Victoria. He correctly identified it as the source of the White Nile. There were no towering, snow-capped mountains feeding it, just a complex system of rainfall and rivers. The ancient map was wrong. The dismantling of this myth was more than a geographical correction. It was a collapse of classical authority. It demonstrated that a story, once given the weight of tradition and printed on a map, could outlive empires. But why did this lie persist for so long, even in the face of contradictory evidence? The answer lies not with the explorers in the field, but with the map publishers back in London and Amsterdam, who often preferred a beautiful, authoritative error to a messy, uncertain truth. A cartographer's pen was not just a tool for recording the world, but for building a personal fortune. The most famous names in mapmaking, like Gerardus Mercator, were not just scholars, they were savvy businessmen operating in a fiercely competitive industry. Mercator's primary source of income was not from royal patrons, but from selling his maps and atlases directly to a growing middle class of merchants, officials, and educated citizens. This commercial reality created a powerful incentive. A map filled with blank spaces, while perhaps more honest, was a difficult product to sell. A map teeming with illustrations of sea monsters, detailed city views, and speculative coastlines, however, was a spectacle. It promised adventure and knowledge, and it flew off the shelves. For a publisher, the choice was clear. Accuracy was often less profitable than spectacle. This led to a culture of rampant plagiarism. A successful map from a competitor would be quickly copied. its geographical details, and more importantly its errors, reproduced exactly. There was no copyright, and verifying a claim meant funding an expensive voyage that might take years. It was far cheaper and faster to simply redraw what had already been printed, locking in mistakes for another generation. The bizarre case of the Zeno map perfectly illustrates this toxic blend of commerce and deception. Published in Venice in 1558, it claimed to be based on the voyages of the Zeno brothers 2 centuries earlier. The map depicted a wildly inaccurate North Atlantic, including a large island called Friesland and a detailed coastline for a place called Estetiland. For over a century, this map was considered authoritative, yet most historians now believe the entire narrative was a clever forgery, concocted by a descendant to claim Venetian precedence in New World exploration. The map was a commercial success, and its fictional lands were eagerly copied by other mapmakers, including the great Mercator himself, who incorporated Friesland into his own influential world maps. The lie was simply too profitable to question. This marketplace where exciting fiction outsold boring fact created a self-perpetuating cycle of error. A single forger's imagination could redirect the course of cartography for 100 years, proving that the authority of a map often had less to do with its truth than with the reputation of the name printed in its corner. A signature at the bottom of a map could silence 1,000 eyewitness accounts. The name Ptolemy, the ancient Greek scholar, carried so much weight that for over a millennium his vision of the world was considered gospel. His Geographia, a work of astounding brilliance for its time, also contained profound errors. Ptolemy depicted the Indian Ocean as a giant landlocked sea, completely enclosed by a southern continent. For centuries, any sailor who returned from the East with tales of an open ocean leading to new lands was dismissed. The map, backed by the ultimate classical authority, said otherwise. This is the immense power of cartographic inertia. An error once committed to parchment by a revered source gains a life of its own. It is copied by the next mapmaker, and the next, not out of malice, but out of a deep-seated respect for tradition. The line on the map becomes more real than the coastline it purports to represent. We see this with the phantom island of Friesland, which persisted on charts for over a century simply because respected mapmakers like Mercator and Ortelius had included it. Challenging these established truths was not just a matter of presenting new evidence, it was an act of intellectual rebellion. A Portuguese sea captain who had actually sailed around the Cape of Good Hope knew the Indian Ocean was open, yet his lived experience was considered less valid than a 2,000-year-old diagram. This created a bizarre feedback loop where explorers, armed with their flawed charts, would sometimes misinterpret what they were seeing. A navigator expecting to find the coast of Asia might land in the Americas and force his observations to fit Ptolemy's framework, convinced he had merely found an outlying island. The map was filtering reality itself. Breaking this cycle required more than just better ships or more courageous sailors. It demanded a fundamental shift in how knowledge was validated. The age of scientific surveying would eventually dawn, replacing the authority of a name with the authority of verifiable, repeatable measurement. But that shift was a battle, fought not with swords, but with sextants and the painstaking work of questioning every line on the page. A new kind of army marched across the countryside, but their weapons were not muskets and cannon. They carried theodolites and giant precision-made chains. This was the vanguard of the scientific revolution in cartography, a systematic campaign to measure the world itself. The 18th and 19th centuries saw nations mobilize their greatest scientific minds not for conquest, but for triangulation. The goal was audacious: to create a map so accurate that not a single river or hill would be out of place. In France, 4 generations of the Cassini family dedicated themselves to this task. They began by laying down a baseline, a single, impeccably measured line across flat ground. From the endpoints of this line, they would sight a distant hilltop, measuring the angles with their instruments. This formed a perfect triangle. Knowing one side and two angles, they could calculate the exact distance to that hilltop without ever walking to it. That hilltop then became the new point for another triangle, creating an unbreakable web of measurements that slowly, methodically crawled across the entire nation. The Great Trigonometrical Survey of India undertook an even more monumental version of this, measuring the arc of the meridian across the subcontinent and eventually revealing the true, staggering heights of the Himalayas. For the first time, the map was being built not from stories or guesses, but from immutable mathematical law. This painstaking process was powered by new tools of incredible precision. The theodolite allowed surveyors to measure horizontal and vertical angles with an accuracy that was previously unimaginable, and John Harrison's marine chronometer, which solved the longitude problem, meant that these new, precise land maps could be correctly positioned on the globe. The art of the cartographer was being replaced by the science of the surveyor. For a merchant in London, this was a revolution in risk management. His ship's captain could now sail with a chart that showed not only the true shape of the coastline, but also the exact depth of the water and the location of every submerged hazard. Trade routes became faster, safer, and far more predictable. Insurance premiums fell as the specter of shipwreck retreated. The map was finally becoming a reliable mirror of the world. Yet, this new age of precision could not undo the economic geography that centuries of error had built. Entire trading empires had been founded on the back of those flawed maps. The legacy of those lies was now set in stone, in the form of great port cities and commercial alliances that had been established by accident. An entire trading company could be founded on the pursuit of a coastline that was pure fiction. The phantom island of Brassel, said to lie somewhere in the misty Atlantic west of Ireland, was one such powerful lure. For centuries, its promise lingered on charts, a circular island of fabled riches that drew English merchants to fund expedition after expedition. These voyages, searching for an island that was nothing more than a cartographic ghost, consumed capital and maritime effort that could have been spent establishing trade with real, accessible ports. This was not a simple navigational error. It was a misallocation of a nation's commercial ambition on a grand scale. The belief in a navigable Northwest Passage is an even more profound example. Maps for centuries hinted at a clear sea route across the top of North America, a shortcut to the spices of the East that would break the monopolies of Southern powers. This single geographical idea, though ultimately false, became an engine of economic policy. It motivated the founding of the Hudson's Bay Company, one of the most powerful commercial enterprises in history, which was granted a royal charter to explore and control this theoretical passage. The company's entire initial purpose was to find a route that did not exist, yet the pursuit of that myth led to the establishment of a vast fur trading empire that shaped the destiny of a continent. The error on the map did not just redirect a ship, it redirected the flow of capital and colonial power for 300 years. Similarly, the exaggerated depictions of Asian wealth on magnificent works like the Catalan Atlas did not merely inspire wanderlust. They served as prospectuses for investment. When a map showed the court of the Great Khan overflowing with gold and spices, it was a direct invitation for merchant guilds and kings to finance risky voyages, hoping to tap into that legendary wealth. These cartographic exaggerations justified the immense startup costs of exploration, leading to the formation of state-backed trading monopolies like the English and Dutch East India Companies. These companies, in turn, became the world's first multinational corporations, altering global economics forever. The very architecture of world trade, with its east-west shipping lanes and its powerful corporate entities, was drafted by mapmakers who were often working from a blend of rumor, hope, and deliberate deception. Paths of commerce were not discovered so much as they were drawn, first in ink and then in the wake of countless ships. The solid ground beneath a sailor's feet was not the deck of his ship, but the unwavering certainty of his map. To discover that chart was a lie was to experience a special kind of terror, a cognitive collapse navigators called chart shock. Imagine the vertigo of staring at your most trusted guide, a document you had staked your life and your crew's survival upon, only to watch it disintegrate into fantasy before your eyes. A crew could spend weeks sailing toward a promised coastline, their morale and supplies dwindling, only to find nothing but an unbroken horizon where a continent should have been. The map said land, their eyes said sea. In that moment, who do you trust, the authority of printed parchment or the terrifying evidence of your own senses? This crisis of confidence could paralyze a voyage. Seasoned captains would second-guess every decision, and fearful crews could mutiny, convinced their leader had led them into a void. This profound vulnerability was not lost on those with malicious intent. Pirates understood this psychology perfectly. There are accounts of privateers deliberately seeding false charts into port taverns, maps that showed safe, deep channels through treacherous archipelagos. A merchant captain, acquiring what he believed was a stolen secret, would follow the bait directly onto a waiting reef, where the pirates would then loot his stranded vessel. The deception was not just tactical, it was deeply personal, a manipulation of the very trust that made long-distance travel possible. This psychological dimension reveals that a map's greatest power was not in its lines, but in the faith people placed in them. When that faith shattered, the damage was more than a sunken ship, it was a broken worldview. That same fragile relationship between user and interface echoes into our own time, where we now place a similar, often unthinking, trust in the digital maps that guide our daily lives. The sky itself became a map maker. With the dawn of the 20th century, cartography underwent its most profound revolution since the invention of the printing press. Aerial photography allowed surveyors to see the Earth from a godlike perspective, stripping away the guesswork and revealing the true contours of every coastline and mountain range. Later, satellites provided a constant, unwavering eye in orbit, capturing the planet in stunning, unarguable detail. In theory, this should have been the final chapter for all major cartographic errors. The phantom islands and misplaced continents had nowhere left to hide. Yet, the old, flawed paper charts refused to surrender. In ship navigation rooms and military planning offices worldwide, these outdated maps remained in active use, their familiar, in-kai coastlines trusted over the newfangled photographs. The reason was a monumental logistical nightmare. Updating the entire world's chart collection was a task of staggering cost and complexity. Think of a single naval vessel, its chart room filled with hundreds of individual maps covering every potential route across the globe. Replacing every single one of those charts with a new, verified edition was a years-long process. For a merchant captain on a tight schedule, the devil you knew was often safer than the angel you had not yet received. This created a dangerous overlap period where a ship using a 50-year-old chart could be sailing in the same waters as a vessel guided by satellite imagery, each operating with a completely different understanding of the same seascape. Even popular world atlases sold to the public were slow to change, often reprinting editions that contained geographical myths simply because the plates were already made and it was cheaper than starting over. Then, just as the old mistakes were being purged, a new species of error was born in the digital age. Consider the case of Gravity Island. In the early 21st century, this landmass began appearing on some digital mapping services and even weather maps south of Australia. It was not a ghost from the age of sail, but a phantom created by a single, simple keystroke. A data transcription error from a digital bathymetric database had mislabeled a deep-sea gravitational anomaly as a physical island. The software, programmed to plot landmasses, faithfully drew a shape that corresponded to absolutely nothing in the real ocean. This was a new kind of lie, one generated not by human hope or deception, but by a flaw in the invisible code that now underpins our reality. The quest for a perfectly accurate map had not ended with satellites. It had simply moved to a new, digital battlefield where errors could replicate at the speed of light. A phantom roundabout in the English countryside directed drivers straight into an empty field for years. This was not a relic from the age of sail, but a glitch born in the 21st century, a digital ghost that refused to disappear. Our modern maps, for all their satellite imagery and algorithmic precision, are just as vulnerable to fiction as the old parchment charts. They are a new layer of reality, and like any human creation, they are prone to mistakes and manipulation. The case of the Alconbury roundabout is a perfect example of a data transposition error, a modern equivalent of a medieval scribe miscopying a coastline. A digital cartographer likely placed a traffic circle in the wrong location within a geographic database. That single misplaced point was then replicated across every update of the map, from the free services on your phone to the professional navigation systems used by trucking companies. Delivery drivers, trusting their screens, would find themselves instructed to turn where no road existed, their schedules disrupted by a loop of digital nonsense. This is the new face of cartographic error, a lie that spreads at the speed of light. But some falsehoods are not accidents. The open nature of platforms like OpenStreetMap, which allows users to contribute data, has given rise to a new phenomenon, map vandalism. A prankster can easily add a fake pizza parlor to a residential street or draw a non-existent footpath through a private garden. While this might seem harmless, the consequences ripple outward. A food delivery driver wastes precious time and fuel searching for a restaurant that is not there. An ambulance crew, relying on their navigation system in a crisis, could be sent down a dead-end alley that exists only in the data. These digital deceptions may not sink galleons, but they clog the arteries of modern logistics and can, in extreme cases, cost lives. The underlying truth remains unchanged from the days of the Padrao reel. The map is a representation, a model of the world built from data, and that data can be flawed, corrupted, or deliberately poisoned. We have traded the authority of the master cartographer for the wisdom and folly of the crowd. So the next time your navigation app confidently instructs you to drive into a field, remember the legacy of those old, lying maps. The medium has changed, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. The map is still a story, and not every story is true. The island of California remained on certain maps for decades after its debunking, a stubborn ghost in the atlas. This was not an isolated case. The annals of cartography are filled with myths that refuse to die, their appeal so powerful they outlived the very evidence that disproved them. Perhaps the most glittering of these fantasies was Zipangu, the name Marco Polo gave to Japan. He never actually set foot there, relying instead on second-hand tales from Chinese merchants. His travelogue described an island where the palaces were roofed not with tile but with solid gold. This single, vivid image of a land paved with precious metal captivated Europe for centuries. It was this dream of Zipangu that burned in the mind of Christopher Columbus as he sailed west, his copies of Polo's work heavily annotated in the margins. He believed he had reached the outer islands of this golden empire when he made landfall in the Caribbean. The entire European project in the Americas was, in its earliest days, a quest for a cartographic mirage, a kingdom of gold that existed only in the lines of a traveler's tale. This myth directly fueled the expeditions that followed, each one hoping to find the real Zipangu just beyond the next headland. The economic and human cost of this golden fantasy is incalculable, driving exploration down paths of brutal conquest in search of a prize that was pure fiction. Another myth that held an unshakable grip on the map was the true source of the Nile. For centuries, the answer was presumed to be the mythical mountains of the moon. This was not just an academic debate. Controlling the Nile meant controlling Egypt, and controlling Egypt meant dominating the trade routes between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. Nations and fortune hunters poured money and lives into the search for the river's origin, guided by a map feature that was a 2,000-year-old guess. The mystery was only finally solved in the 1850s and 60s by explorers like John Hanning Speke, who traced the source to the vast inland sea of Lake Victoria, a body of water not fed by snow-capped peaks but by rainfall. The cartographic correction was a seismic event, collapsing a classical truth that had directed the course of empires. Why do these myths persist so stubbornly? A map is more than a tool. It is a story we tell ourselves about the world. A story about an island of gold or a secret mountain range is simply more compelling than a blank space or a complex hydrological cycle. We are drawn to the romance of the unknown, even when the truth is finally known. The map, in the end, reflects not just the shape of the land, but the contours of our own desires. A misplaced line on a map did more than wreck a ship. It shattered an entire worldview. The legacy of these cartographic lies is a powerful reminder of our own vulnerability to beautifully presented information. At its core, this history is a masterclass in humility. It forces us to acknowledge that even the most trusted authorities, from Ptolemy to a modern digital platform, can be profoundly and consequentially wrong. The real danger was never the error itself, but the unwavering faith placed in it. Sailors spent weeks searching for phantom islands not because they were foolish, but because the map, a product of esteemed experts, told them it must be there. This is the insidious power of confirmation bias, the human tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of our existing beliefs. We see what we expect to see. A captain expecting a coastline would often misinterpret fog banks or cloud formations as land, his perception filtered through the expectation his map had created. This psychological trap is just as potent today. A business leader presented with a sleek data dashboard might overlook subtle flaws because the overall presentation feels authoritative and confirms their strategic assumptions. The map, whether drawn on vellum or rendered on a screen, creates a powerful reality distortion field. For any modern professional, from a logistics manager routing global shipments to an investor analyzing market trends, the lesson is clear. Blind trust in a single source of information is a catastrophic risk. The merchant princes of Lisbon who guarded the Padrão Real understood that control of the map meant control of commerce. Today, that control has shifted to those who control data. Verifying critical information against multiple, independent sources is no longer just a best practice. It is a fundamental shield against modern-day chart shock. The financial cost of acting on a flawed map in the age of sail was measured in lost fleets and bankrupted kingdoms. Today, that cost is measured in misallocated billions, failed product launches, and supply chain collapses. These ancient blunders hold up a unique mirror to our own relationship with knowledge. They ask us a simple, haunting question. What are the maps you are using today, and how do you know they are telling you the truth? A map could preach a silent sermon to anyone who unfolded it. This is the art of cartographic propaganda, where a lie is not a mistake but a carefully crafted message. Beyond the misplaced coastlines and phantom islands lies a more deliberate form of deception, one designed to persuade and control. Consider the medieval Mappa Mundi, those magnificent circular maps housed in European cathedrals. They were not meant for navigation but for instruction. They placed Jerusalem squarely at the center of the known world, with Europe, Asia, and Africa arranged around it like petals. This was not a geographical fact, it was a theological statement, a visual representation of a faith-based universe where humanity's spiritual epicenter dictated the physical layout of the planet. For a merchant viewing such a map, the message was subtle but clear. Your commercial travels exist within a divine order, and some places hold a sacred significance that transcends their economic value. This central placement reinforced the Crusades and directed both pilgrimage and trade toward the Holy Land, shaping the flow of people and capital for centuries. The power to place your city, your kingdom, or your ideology at the center of the world is the ultimate act of cartographic persuasion. This practice did not end with the Age of Faith. During the Cold War, maps produced by both NATO and the Warsaw Pact became powerful rhetorical weapons. A standard map from the West might depict the Soviet Union in a menacing, expanding shade of red, its borders thick and bold to emphasize its perceived territorial appetite. Conversely, Soviet maps would often shrink the military bases of the United States and its allies, visually minimizing their global reach while exaggerating the interconnected, peaceful bloc of communist nations. For a business leader or a politician analyzing these maps, the chosen colors and labels were not neutral. They were designed to provoke fear, justify military spending, and influence international trade policy. A merchant might be discouraged from investing in a region depicted as unstable or hostile, their commercial decisions swayed by a carefully constructed cartographic image. The very framework of the map, its projection, is a loaded choice. The ubiquity of the Mercator projection in Western schools and atlases for generations was no accident. Its dramatic exaggeration of the size of colonial powers in Europe made their overseas possessions appear more vast and significant. On a Mercator map, the colonial holdings in Africa, though physically immense, were often shrunk, while the colonizing nations themselves loomed large. This visual bias subtly reinforced a political hierarchy, making imperial dominance seem like a natural, geographical fact. It was a lie of scale, one that shaped how generations perceived global power dynamics. Every cartographic decision, from the thickness of a border to the name of a city, carries weight. A disputed territory labeled with one name claims it for one nation, erasing the claims of another. A strategic shipping lane colored as international waters on one map might be shaded as a territorial claim on another. For the merchant, these were not academic debates. A map that showed a rival's port lying within a contested zone could be the difference between a profitable trade agreement and a diplomatic incident. To understand that every map is an argument is to become a more critical reader of the world. It forces a question: whose world view are you buying when you buy the map? A stubborn lie on a map could also become an accidental engine of discovery. For all the shipwrecks and financial ruin caused by cartographic errors, history reveals a strange paradox. Some of humanity's greatest leaps forward were unintentional consequences of using bad information. The most monumental of these fortunate errors began with a determined Genoese sailor and a collection of deeply flawed charts. Christopher Columbus was convinced the Earth was smaller than most scholars believed, and his maps, based on the work of the ancient geographer Ptolemy, seemed to confirm it. These charts showed a single, massive ocean stretching between Europe and the riches of Asia, with no continent in between. He was, by every measure, catastrophically lost, guided by a fundamental miscalculation. Yet his unwavering faith in those erroneous maps propelled him across the Atlantic, where he stumbled upon a world entirely unknown to Europe. The subsequent Columbian Exchange, for all its profound and tragic consequences, permanently connected the Eastern and Western hemispheres, swapping crops, animals, and cultures on a global scale. This was not the trade route he sought, but it became one far more transformative. The same dynamic played out for centuries in the frozen North. The mythical Northwest Passage was a cartographic siren song, a promised shortcut that lured countless expeditions to their doom in the ice-choked channels of the Canadian Arctic. While the passage itself proved impassable for trade, the relentless search for it had an unintended benefit. Each failed voyage returned with more detailed charts, more accurate soundings, and a better understanding of that brutal, beautiful landscape. The maps grew progressively more precise, not because the goal was found, but because the search for a phantom forced a systematic exploration of a real coastline. Vast stretches of territory were mapped for the first time, not out of pure scientific curiosity, but because a navigational error had created an obsession. This is the hidden silver lining in the history of cartographic lies. A map that points in the wrong direction can still lead you to something valuable, so long as you are paying attention to the real world passing outside your window. The very act of correcting a persistent error often yields a deeper, richer understanding than if the map had been perfectly accurate from the start. The dream of a perfect map, immune to the ghosts of old errors, now lives in the cloud. Artificial intelligence sifts through petabytes of satellite imagery, cross-referencing street view data, and user reports to spot inconsistencies a human cartographer would miss. It can identify a newly constructed road before the official plans are published or flag a digital phantom like Gravity Island for deletion. These systems are learning the language of the landscape itself, promising a future where our maps are living documents, updated in real time by a global nervous system of orbiting satellites and ground-level sensors. Imagine a navigation app that doesn't just show traffic, but dynamically redraws the road network minutes after an earthquake or a landslide. This is the tantalizing goal, a self-healing cartography where error has no place to hide. Yet this new paradigm introduces its own unique perils. The same artificial intelligence that hunts for mistakes can also generate them. An AI model, trained on millions of images of coastlines, might hallucinate a small bay or a promontory that does not exist, inventing a feature with statistical plausibility rather than observational truth. These algorithmic ghosts could be even harder to eradicate than the paper phantoms of the past, because their origin is a black box of complex calculations. Furthermore, the centralization of map data creates a single point of catastrophic failure. A sophisticated cyber attack could, in theory, poison these global datasets. A hostile actor could erase vital roads from a city's map during an emergency, digitally divert rivers to cause logistical chaos, or subtly shift national borders to provoke international incidents. The economic disruption would be instantaneous and global, a silent attack on the very infrastructure of modern commerce. The quest for the flawless map is revealing itself to be a paradox. The more complex and interconnected our systems become, the more vulnerable they are to new, more sophisticated forms of the old deceptions. The merchant of the future will not fear a forgotten reef, but a manipulated algorithm, proving that the fundamental relationship between the map and the world it represents remains a story of trust and the perpetual risk of betrayal. Your own phone holds a map filled with subtle fictions designed to catch a thief. Cartographic copyright traps, known as paper towns or trap streets, are deliberate errors planted by mapmakers to protect their intellectual property. A map publisher might insert a tiny, non-existent lane between two real streets, or invent a small pond in a suburban park. If a competing map suddenly shows that same fictional feature, it's undeniable proof of plagiarism. One of the most famous examples is the town of Aglow, New York, invented in the 1930s by the General Drafting Company. It was a pure fiction, a copyright trap that later appeared on a map produced by Rand McNally, leading to a legendary legal battle. The fascinating twist is that someone eventually built a general store at the spot marked Aglow on the map, and for a brief time, the fiction willed itself into reality. These phantom places are hiding in plain sight on the digital maps you use every day. So how do you spot them? Try this simple experiment. Pull up your favorite mapping application and look at the same location on a different platform, like comparing Google Maps to Apple Maps. Zoom in on a familiar neighborhood. Do all the footpaths align perfectly? Is that little alleyway behind the supermarket actually there on both versions? You will likely find small, puzzling discrepancies, a park bench in the wrong place, a building that appears on one service but not the other. These tiny differences are the digital echoes of an age-old problem. Have you ever been led astray by a GPS or digital map? Perhaps it confidently directed you down a one-way street the wrong way, or insisted your destination was in the middle of a vacant lot. That moment of frustration is a modern form of chart shock, a personal encounter with the gap between the map and the world. Share your story in the comments below. Your experience is part of this long, unfinished history of navigating by trust, reminding us that the most dangerous map is the one we forget to question. From the phantom islands that haunted medieval sailors to the digital glitches that mislead modern drivers, the history of cartography is inextricably linked with the history of error. Our journey through the maps that lied reveals a fundamental truth. These were not just mistakes on parchment, but forces that rerouted the flow of global commerce, toppled financial empires, and drew the accidental borders of our modern world. Every misplaced coastline and invented mountain range was a decision etched in ink, a story that merchants and kings used to navigate reality. The ultimate lesson is not that old mapmakers were incompetent, but that every map is a story, a carefully constructed narrative blending observation, assumption, and sometimes outright deception. The philosopher Alfred Korzybski captured this perfectly when he said, "The map is not the territory. The representation is never the reality. Your navigation app is not the road, and a chart from 1720 is not the ocean." This distinction is our most vital tool for navigating not just geography, but the flood of information we encounter every day. It invites a healthy skepticism, a curiosity to look beyond the lines and ask what story is being told and why. If this journey through the cartographic shadows has intrigued you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the mysteries of our past. And we would love to hear from you. Which of these cartographic errors, from the island of California to the phantom roundabouts of the digital age, do you find most fascinating? Share your thoughts in the comments below.